Hi, Glenn.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well indeed. Cannot complain.
Okay, well, good. Let me introduce us. I don't think many people who are regulars at Blogging Heads TV certainly need to have you introduced. You are the host of the Glenn Show,
I am.
seen globally, and if our plans for the future hold up, intergalactically at some point. But
Well, everywhere from Norwich in the east of England to Canberra, Australia, I have encountered people on the street who say, "Hey, you're Glenn Loury." I'm
really,
not kidding. It's an unbelievable thing.
and we attribute this to Blogging Heads, do we? Not to your various other
I
manifestations?
know it's blogging heads. I mean, people might know my name, but not so much my face from the fact that I write, essays and op-eds and things
Mhm.
like that. But they recognize me on the street because they watch the dialogues that we do.
Well, that's great. If we've helped you get a good seat at a restaurant somewhere, more power to you. Although that part probably hasn't happened yet. So anyway, this is a conversation actually for Blogging Heads, the sister site meaningoflife.tv, and we're going to talk about the meaning of life. In particular, the meaning of Glenn Loury's life. We should say also by way of introduction. Of course, you're a noted economist and public intellectual, written about public policy for some time. Um, where do you want to start on the meaning of life? On the meaning of your life? What gives your life meaning? Why are you said you're in a very good mood? You're happy. Why are you so happy?
Well, I mean, one reason is that I'm on sabbatical leave and I'm in residence in Stanford, California, and
Oh, are you at the Center for the Advanced Study? What's it called?
it is called the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, CASPAS for short. And it sits just above Stanford's campus in the hills here, and it's a semi-autonomous institution affiliated with the university.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a year free from committee meetings and memoranda writing and student, encounters, so that I can sort out my program here. It's an idyllic setting. It's so exciting to be in the company of so many, really first-rate anthropologists, historians, philosophers, sociologists,
Mm-hmm.
and the odd economists, political scientists. So that contributes to my mood. But I think I'm still also basking. You ask what gives my life meaning, in the afterglow of having spent a week on the North Carolina Outer Banks shore with my children, all
Mm-hmm.
five of them, and my grandchildren, all six of them.
Oh, you know what they say about grandchildren? All of the joy of children and none of the responsibility.
Indeed, although sometimes the financial responsibility does kick
Oh,
in.
I see. There is
You know,
that.
but I'm not complaining. And it was just a wonderful, sweet time that we all had there together. The Lowry clan, at least me and my progeny. So that was helpful in boosting my mood.
That's great because family encounters can go either way. I don't know about your family encounters, but families are complicated.
Families are just tremendously complicated. I think of my wife, my late wife, Linda, who passed away 4 years ago, and her sister didn't attend the funeral because of a breach within the family that had gotten bitter and
Mm-hmm.
deep. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm still trying to comprehend, uh, and I'm just profoundly saddened every time I think about it. And I know that it was extremely painful to my wife when she was living, that she was estranged from her sister. But there you are,
Yeah.
and that's just one example.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on having a family gathering not afflicted by such things. So, now you grew up, you had a religious background, and I think you're kind of, maybe I'm wrong about that. At some point you became an evangelical, at some point you were an evangelical Christian, right?
Well, that is correct. And yes, my background growing up in Chicago was not divorced from the church. My mother almost never went, but my aunt, and I grew up in a household where my aunt was the matron, insisted that we kids get out, her children and me and my sister, every Sunday, and get on the bus and get down to the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in
Mm-hmm.
time for Sunday school. And I sang in the choir, And I was embedded as a young member of the church until I'd say about the age of 17, when I became old enough to make my own decisions and decided that I'd stay in bed until noon on Sunday mornings and not get that bus. I wasn't profoundly religious, but it was just a part of the, it was just a part of the atmosphere. It was just part of the culture,
Mm-hmm.
and had a respect and a certain kind of fondness for some of the experiences, especially the music, the fellowship. It was a setting of social encounter. I met my first wife and the mother of two of my children in that church when I would have been maybe 17 and she maybe 14 years old. So the church was there, but I wouldn't say that I was religious, and certainly not in any doctrinal sense. Did I have an identity as a religious person?
Well, did you believe in God?
Yes. If you had asked, do I believe in God, I would have said yes. But
Well, I think these days that definitely qualifies as religious, Glenn. there are things short of that are being called religious.
It was awfully hard to grow up in that milieu and not, quote, believe in God, close quote, although it's simply because everyone did, and that was sort of taken for granted. And
Mm-hmm.
it would have been, idiosyncratic, to say the least, to have staked out a position as an atheist at the age of 13 or 14 growing up in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd say if you'd asked me by the time I was 21 years old if I believe in God, I'd probably give you some weak, I'm an agnostic, I don't know, type answer.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until I was in my late 30s, you say, born again, yes, that I came into a serious encounter with Christianity and submitted myself, if you will, to the frame of mind and the devotions and the set of practices of prayer and study.
What kind of encounter was it? Was it a sudden encounter? Was it a born-again experience?
It was in connection with recovering from drug addiction, Bob. I had a serious cocaine problem in my 30s,
mm-hmm.
and it almost wrecked me. And in the long journey from crack cocaine addict to teetotaling, abstemious, straight, clean, and sober Glenn,
Mm-hmm.
the role of religion and my sort of admitting that my life was out of control, admitting that I didn't have within myself the power to rectify it, looking to, as they say in the 12-step movement, a higher power,
Mm-hmm.
And finding the solace and support and encouragement of a group of seriously committed people around a particular congregation in Boston. That I was able finally to pull the strands of my life together to write myself. It was absolutely critical as a part of that. But I wasn't undertaking this journey into a deeper spirituality and into a kind of commitment and belief. I wasn't undertaking it only in the instrumental, sense because it was a part of my therapy.
Mm-hmm.
I believed, transformed by an encounter with the Spirit of the Lord, with Jesus Christ. I wrote about this, Bob. I have a little essay in my 1995 volume, One by One from the Inside Out,
Mm-hmm.
about what it meant to me in those years, this journey into a deeper spirituality, and how it allowed me to sort of make sense out of my life, which was, as I say, seriously off the rails.
And and this episode in your life that preceded your fairly sudden or at least greatly increased commitment to religion, that was an interesting time because you were an academic at Harvard, right? You were respected. You were leading two lives, and
that's absolutely right. I was a professor of political economy at the Kennedy School of Government. And had been professor of economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard before moving over to the Kennedy School. I was publishing and esteemed as a theoretical economist, but I was also finding my footing as a social critic and public intellectual, writing in magazines and newspapers and making public appearances and so on. I was a so-called black conservative in the sense that I am black and that my views were right of center relative to the spectrum of political opinion in those years. And indeed, I had been nominated to the position of the number two, the Undersecretary of the Department of Education when William Bennett was Secretary of Education in the second Reagan administration. And but for the fact that my various peccadillos and missteps became public, involvement with drugs and alcohol, and also involvement in an extramarital romantic relationship with a young woman that went bad. But for that fact, I would have served in the Reagan administration. But I ended up having to withdraw with these revelations, and I lapsed into a serious depressive state, and as I say, chemically dependent state that I was only able to. It took a couple of years before I was able to get myself back on in form again.
Often people with a story like that, things were going great for me. I was a professor at Harvard, and yet I did this thing. They're often asked, like, what were you thinking? Why did you do it? Now, I'm not generally a person who asks such questions because it doesn't seem like such a mystery to me. I mean, people are hedonistic. Excuse me, they pursue pleasure. Drugs make them feel good. Sex makes them feel good. I'm wondering how you look back on it. Do you just think, well, I'm a human being. I did the most natural thing you can imagine any organism doing, seeking pleasure, or are you kind of like mystified? Do you think that there was some kind of fundamental flaw in the whole way you were looking at life and what it's about, and that's what led you on this pursuit, or what?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I'm puzzling over a bit now because I'm trying to write this memoir, and I definitely have to deal with these matters. One of the stories that I will tell, and I'm not going to tell any of my other stories here. I'm keeping that for the memoir. But one of the stories I will tell is an encounter I had at a halfway house after I had been released from inpatient, addiction treatment, and I went to a place in Irish Boston, in Dorchester, just above Fields Corner, that was run, called the Hamilton Recovery Homes, that was run by a steely, grizzled veteran of, getting men sober, a guy named Bob Brown, no-nonsense guy. And to make a long story short, Bob confronted me during one of the counseling sessions when I had been going on as a Harvard professor will do, citing chapter and verse from, the recovery book. And, I just knew recovery very well. I understood recovery. I was a recovering addict. I understood it. And he confronted me and he said, in effect, hey, Mr. Smarty Pants, Mr. Harvard professor, Mr. PhD, Dr. Loury, if you're so clever, answer me this. What were you doing out there in the streets of Boston showing your ass like any N-word from the project? Okay? He asked me that question. This is a white guy.
What was his ethnic identity?
He's a white guy. He's an Irish Catholic guy, South Boston born guy.
Well, that was pretty nervy of him to put it that way. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, that was Bob Brown. Yes, indeed, it was nervy of him. And he's shocking people out of their complacency, and he's trying to get them to not drink and face up to what's going on in their lives about why they're drinking and what's at stake and what they need to do day to day. You know how it goes. That's how he felt like he needed to reach me, because I was floating above everything in my own cerebral, verbal cocoon.
He took you out of professor mode.
He definitely did. He shocked me. And I really had a choice to make at that moment as to whether I was going to walk, because after all, the man had called me an N-word, okay? What was I doing showing my butt like an N-word? It was an outrageous thing for him to say to me. I could have walked out of there righteously, I don't have to put up with this.
After punching him.
Perhaps. Although he did stand 6'4" and weighed about 300 pounds.
Or after not punching him. Okay, I get it.
But the thing is, Bob, I did not know the answer to the question. This is the question that you just asked me. And at that time, I didn't know what was up with me and why, true enough, people seek pleasure. True enough, getting high was fun for me to do. True enough, chasing the skirts was also something that I found to be gratifying. But the fact is that I had been for years writing essays in which I'd been, contrasting in terms of the race discussion in the 1980s, the claims against America that blacks would make in the interest of, calling out racism and discrimination for what it is and insisting that it be remedied. I called that the enemy without. And what I wrote about in those years, it's 30 years ago now, the patterns of behavior that I thought were holding African Americans back, that were largely internal to the culture and behaviors of the group, which I called the enemy within. I was making a pretty good living, not just financially, but in terms of status, making that distinction and insisting on it, and insisting that only African Americans, remember, One by One from the Inside Out was the title of that book, only African Americans could grapple with the enemy within, and unless we did, we wouldn't be able to be equal in our status in the society. Mm-hmm. But there you have me leading a secret life in which I was engaging in some of the very kinds of behavior that I was condemning as a matter of my political writings. So there was something profoundly troubling there, and it is something that actually has deep roots in my own biography, because I came up in a working class African American family on the south side of Chicago in the 1950s and the 1960s. And there was a lot of, compromising with the conventions about sexuality and other, drug use and things like that. That was just a commonplace of that environment out of which I emerged. And I'm certainly not faulting, my relatives or neighbors or whatever for my own bad behavior. But I'm just saying I'd always struggled between, on the one hand, wanting to be more street in the way in which I carried myself, taking some pride in being able to manipulate and manage in various environments, like buying crack cocaine on the streets of Boston and surviving without getting robbed. Turns out not to be an easy thing to do unless you know what you're doing. And I was proud of that. While at the same time, I was, developing into a world-renowned social scientist, paid a lot of money, traveling all over the world, invited to state dinners at the White House and other such things. And there was this sort of identity crisis that I was grappling with. And I think that has something to do, a sense that my authenticity as an African American depended perversely in some way on my capacity to navigate these very sort of rocky shoals and nevertheless live to tell about it. I was a confused young man, and my drug use was not just a hedonistic pursuit. I think it was also a kind of self-medication in the face of some real psychological pressures.
Mm-hmm. Now, so you have since found a very different kind of life. Did the religion persist? Did the religious belief persist in practice?
It did for years. It again was a kind of battle of two Glens going on, because there's the rationalist, me, the fellow who was, not given to believing in what I couldn't see, who wanted reasons, okay? And then there was this kind of very needy, fragile, in some ways lost and desperate me, who was holding on to life with his fingernails and looking for hope. I actually ended up in church because when I was in the inpatient addiction treatment program at the McLean Psychiatric Hospital, one part of the program that they had there was a meeting on Friday afternoons where someone from some religious denomination or tradition would come in and talk with the patients about, the challenges that they faced, not to proselytize, but simply to put spirituality on the table as an available place where people could try to figure out what was going on in their lives and what they needed to do with themselves. And an African-American woman who's an associate pastor at a local church visited, and after the formal session took me aside to talk with me and pray with me. And I was moved by it. And she invited me. I was going to be released from this program shortly thereafter. She invited me to come over to the services the following Sunday, which, as it happened, was Easter Sunday. And I went to the services, and I was really, really profoundly moved by it. I sat weeping in my pew and was shaken by it. Now, as it turned out, I subsequently relapsed. I ended up going back into the streets and going back to the use of cocaine, and I had to come back into the inpatient treatment program for another few weeks until my insurance hit its limit, after which I went to the halfway house, which I've mentioned before. I relapsed, but I was introduced to something, both this kind of feeling of being taken out of myself and of encountering something which, if I could just believe that it was real, might be the most important discovery of my life. And also by this sense of, caution, because now I'm a drug addict who's relapsed. I know I've got to take it a day at a time. I know that my meditation is absolutely crucial. I know that prayer, even if I'm not believing that there is, an ear there that's some kind of consciousness that's actually hearing, that I know that this group of people who are together in this act of this sacred act, this practice, are they are each of them holding on to the others, and we're all trying to establish some kind of relationship with the Almighty, and trying plaintively to be heard. And the study of the Bible, which I found deeply consoling. I spent many, many hours reading and memorizing passages from the Bible, and so on. I was drawn in and drawn in further. I became sort of a deacon in this church, not a formal title, but that was the functional role that I was playing, an elder. I was teaching the adult Bible study. I was watching first our son, Glenn II, who's now 26 years old, and then our son, Nehemiah, come into the world. It was a joyous time. I thought I was sunk, and within the bat of an eye, things seemed to be turning around. And the charismatic character of this congregation, they were, speaking in tongues types. They were banging the tambourines and dancing around the church when the Spirit moved people types. They were believing literally in the miraculous healing power of laying hands on people who were...
Were they Pentecostal?
No, it was African Methodist Episcopal, but it had this particular ministry, a Pentecostal flavor to it. It was friendly to Pentecostalism. And believe, that the promises that are made in the Bible, in the book of Acts, about baptism in the Holy Spirit and the powers and, enlightenment and expansion of your spiritual capacity that would come with that, believe that literally. As I said, prayed for healing and expected an answer, and so on. And I found myself very happily ensconced for quite a few years, I'd say 8 or 10 years, in that posture. But at the back of my mind, there were always these nagging doubts. And I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe this is another one of the things I need to explore very carefully. I mean, there was a particular incident, a woman who had worked for me for about 5 or 6 years, and then a young woman, and she'd been my administrative assistant at a small institute that I was running at Boston University, where I was on the faculty at that time. Her dream had always, her name was Sherry DuPont, and Sherry's dream had always been to go to law school. She was an African-American woman in her 30s, who'd had somewhat of a checkered college career, but had managed to complete her studies from Trinity University in Hartford, Connecticut, and come to work for me in her 30s. She'd always wanted to go to law school, and finally we passed the hat up and down the hallway of our little offices to raise money for her LSAT prep test, and she got herself admitted to Boston University Law School. She aced the first year brilliantly, made law review, but contracted a viral infection of the heart. And by September of what would have been her second year in law school, she was dead. She died. She was on the waiting list for a heart transplant, and the next thing I knew, she had expired. So that was Sherry, and I loved this woman as one might love a good friend, and was just devastated by her death. And our church had the funeral because she happened to have been a member of the church. Now, the funeral was this celebration of the fact that she was going to live forever. God loved her so much that he took her unto himself at that early age. We had come not to mourn the death, but to celebrate the everlasting life of Sherry DuPont. And people were dancing joyously around that sanctuary. Her own mother told me to my face that I should not mourn her death, that it was okay. She was now with the Lord. And I have to tell you, Bob, I found that posture and that ceremony preposterous and cowardly. Because my thought was that, this is a tragedy beyond imagining. Don't tell me that this is a part of God's plan. Don't try to make this okay. Don't try to make this a joyous occasion. Can we simply grieve her death? Can we look down into the abyss of meaningless suffering and loss and simply contemplate the nature of our human condition? It's not that easy. There are not answers for everything. Don't try to make me think that this was okay. I found myself digging out my old Friedrich Nietzsche's anti-Christian rants that I had read as a college student and rereading it to try to figure out what the heck was wrong with these cowardly Christians who couldn't acknowledge that life was full of loss of this kind for which there would be no easy answer. And it was like a catalyst that reignited the intellectual doubts that I had been carrying all along, because I don't believe in magic. I'm saying to myself, as an MIT trained, PhD and so forth and so on, give me reasons. I don't believe in magic. I was good friends with the late Richard John Newhouse, the theologian and public intellectual. We had become good friends during my years as a neoconservative, and we remained friends even after I moved a little bit away from that political orientation. And I got on a plane in Boston and flew down to New York and sat up in his rooms in Lower Manhattan and drank a half a bottle of scotch with him and contemplated my doubt. I mean, I was going to him for answers. I said, Richard, I can't believe anymore. And he laughed in my face. He said, you thought this was going to be easy? You thought believing was going to be easy? He says, there's doubt inside of belief, and there's belief inside of the doubt that's inside of that belief. This is not easy. And then he reminded me of what Christ said on his way to the, crucifixion, that if this burden could be lifted from him, etc. And probably quoted Aquinas or something, as, Richard would have been inclined to do, but I don't remember the exact chapter and verse on that. Just to say, I experienced it as a real traumatic crisis. I just couldn't find my faith anymore. And to be honest with you, I haven't found it since.
Wow. So on the one hand, I mean, religion may have saved your life.
I think so, yeah.
And on the other hand, you in the end couldn't accept all the tenets it seemed to rest on. I'm curious, during when religion was working for you, you talked about prayer. And you put some kind of asterisk there and said, regardless of whether I thought of there actually being a conscious being that was listening. I mean, was the prayer accompanied by explicit beliefs that there was a kind of anthropomorphic God listening? Or are you saying that the prayer, what was making the prayer work, wasn't quite so much explicit belief as the whole social context and the power of the ritual in the sense of communion and so on?
I'm saying the latter. I'm saying that I could never quite suspend my disbelief about some of the claims, the healing claims. I didn't believe them. I mean, I didn't believe anything that we were going to do in that sanctuary in terms of the fervency of our calling on the Holy Spirit to come amongst us and to heal this woman who has breast cancer, who would be dead in 6 months. was going to make a difference in the outcome in her life. I had a very, very hard time. I always had a hard time believing it. But I felt that I was in the right place amongst such people, and that their faith would be enough to carry me through. You know what I mean? I just stick with them. I mean, I was in the right place. I didn't have to have all the answers. It wasn't a cognitive proposition. It wasn't a cause-effect proposition that I imagined it as more of a, well, I'm not sure, I was in the right place. I guess I want to rest on that.
Okay. So you've you've led a long stretch of your life without religious belief. Has that made it harder to live a life that felt full of meaning? Or
yeah. Now, it may be that the Glenn of today, who is not a believer, at least not in the same way that I once was, will say of the Glenn of yesteryear, whose life was full of meaning, that there was a certain amount of self-delusion, and that if the problem of tragic loss and unfathomable and inexplicable suffering isn't so easy to answer, then neither is the problem of finding meaning in my life. It may be that the Glenn of today would look back on the meaning that I thought I'd found centered in that congregation and say that there was that I was fooling myself to a certain degree, that it was never going to be that easy. Though I must say that people who are happily ensconced there certainly act as if they found meaning there. They've got a roadmap, they've got a plan. They submit every aspect of their lives to this, wanting to do the will of God, wanting to know it and wanting to do it. It's ordering.
And do you think that's a positive thing? In other words, if you could choose to either disabuse them of their faith or let them keep living their lives, and the question was which is better for the world, what would you do?
I'd leave them to their faith. I've had this conversation with my son, who's a gay man and doesn't at all like this relatively conservative Protestant congregation because of their views about the moral status of homosexuality. And what I say to him is, I know they're wrong about that, Glenn. They're wrong about the moral status of who you are, of how God made you. They're wrong about that. But they're good people, I want to say. And I'm staking that claim in large part upon the way in which they've, by being immersed in this religious institution, become a kind of community of selflessness, of love, of charity, of, humility, of and so on. And, I believe that that's true. I wouldn't want to dispel their illusions in the interest of the kind of epistemic, you guys believe something that's not true. Truth is the first order of business. Let me tell you what I think is wrong with what you believe or why you shouldn't believe it or whatever. I wouldn't want to burst their bubble, if you want to put it that way. In the interest simply of, getting them to disavow a belief that I cannot myself hold. I think on the whole, they are, and I almost want to say we are, certainly the neighborhoods in Boston where this congregation has an influence are better for it being a home to a group of people who are practicing the religious faith that my former congregants are practicing.
Okay, now I gather from your earlier remarks when I asked you at the beginning why you so happy these days, you talked about a family encounter you just had. Yeah. I assume if I said, okay, what gives you the post-belief Glenn meaning, you would say things like family and probably things that have something in common with what gave the believing Glenn meaning, in the sense that communion was social communion was part of that religious experience, and I assume you still have social communion, right?
Of course.
Are these? What have I left off the list in terms of sources?
Well, you left work off the list.
Okay.
And the work is not just going into a library and producing some piece of scholarship. The work is as a teacher being so important in the lives of the young charges who come your way. And the gratification that I get from the relationships that develop, which last long beyond the time that the person is an undergraduate at Brown University or wherever it is. I get letters from former students from decades ago. I mean, recently from 30 years ago, of someone who tells me that their encounter with me in the classroom changed their lives. Mm-hmm. And I'm just telling you, for me, for Glenn Loury, there's just nothing better than that. There's nothing better, more meaningful than knowing that when I'm encountering a text or trying to think about a difficult matter of, scholarly interest, or trying to lead students through a serious and rigorous program of critical thought about important issues, seeing the impact that I have on these young people who are, given if you teach at a place like Brown, almost invariably extraordinarily talented and exceptional individuals who in the next quarter century are going to do something, significant with their lives. And to be a part of that is a source of profound meaning. Okay. I mean, more so than getting an article in the journal. I mean, that's great. It goes on the CV. Your colleagues see it. You feel good. You're still, a player because I can do research that my peers think is worthy of being published. But getting a letter from someone you taught 25 years ago who tells you about their children or their grandchildren, or about how they went through 3 different careers and how what you had to say to them about this or that has stuck with them all these years, that just puts me over the top.
Okay. Do you, so you don't believe in God anymore? Do you in any sense believe in higher purpose, in even a very vague, diffuse sense, a larger purpose at work through the workings of nature or anything?
Maybe my answer here is I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but I think I'm really just trying to avoid saying no to you, because I think that's the honest answer. Okay. The honest answer is no.
What about moral truth? I'm steadily scaling back my ambitions in terms of what I can get you to buy into. What about moral truth? Do you believe there's such a thing? Are you, as philosophers say, a moral realist?
Do I think that in the manner of Kant or something, that there is a compelling logical derivation of answers to questions about right and wrong? No. Do I think that communities can evolve self-understandings, norms about right living, ideals toward which people aspire, that can be, that are an expression of our humanity, and that are worthy of being, affirmed and taught to one's children and whatever? Yeah, I do. I'm influenced by a little book that Michael Walzer, the political theorist, wrote some years ago, called Interpretation and Social Criticism. It's not about religion, although he contrasts 3 paths to moral understanding: invention, revelation, and interpretation. So invention is Kant sitting in his study, trying to say, if I take some minimal axioms, what is implied by that as a matter of force of logic. Revelation is Moses comes down with tablets, thus saith the Lord, the truth has been revealed from this on high. And interpretation is a community that seeks constantly to revisit through a regard of its inherited texts and practices over the generations. Judaism, in Walzer's case, would be one such tradition of what is it that our common understandings that we inherit from our forebears imply about how we ought to live now. Mm-hmm. How can we interpret and reinterpret these texts and commentaries and so on, so as to be true to the implicit essence of who we are as a people, or as a believing community, or whatever. And I guess I'm inclining now in my answer to you toward this last, not moral truth as the necessary consequence of our, facilities of reason applied to the environment in which we find ourselves, and not moral truth as, well, I read it in Deuteronomy, it's in the Bible, and therefore. But moral truth, or maybe truth isn't quite the right word, but at least consensus understanding that is malleable, but that comes to us as the fruit of some tradition. And I find in this theologically conservative Protestantism with which I had been associated for so many years, a community that, as I was alluding in reference to my son's difficulty with it, in my effort to get him to think again about that, that is capable, through interpreting and reinterpreting its inherited text and practices, of creating something like a defensible moral understanding about what are our responsibilities to each other, to ourselves, to the planet. Sorry, Bob, I'm babbling. But.
No, it's good. And do I infer correctly? You do, in living your own life, try to align yourself with a set of values that you don't consider, even upon reflection, arbitrary.
Yeah, I would like to think so.
I can get more minimalistic if this one doesn't work for you. I'm moving toward nihilism and seeing if I can stop you somewhere short of that. But go ahead.
Well, okay, I think about different roles. I mentioned my relationships and responsibilities to my students. I mentioned that I'm a father and a grandfather and all that entails. I don't cheat on my taxes. I think one should be faithful and keep one's promises in romance and otherwise, and this kind of thing. And I don't regard those as arbitrary, although I suppose I've been, flailing about trying to say, well, what is the root of such belief? If I have those beliefs, what does it rest upon? And I'm not sure I've got a good answer to that. But I want to say yes in response to your question. There are right and wrong ways of living. I don't think those distinctions are arbitrary. I mean, we could go into other examples of it: theft, violence, a sort of respect for the individual, for the sort of integrity of each individual person. This kind of thing. Anyway, I don't.
Yeah, okay, that's good. So I guess maybe a culminating question for all this is, in some ways, the ultimate one. It's about death. We're all going to die. You're going to die. You have not so long ago suffered through the loss of your wife. Yeah. There's a kind of consolation that was available to you when you were a believing Christian.
Right.
What's the closest thing you can find to a substitute for that kind of consolation?
I don't think there is any substitute for it, which is why the abandonment of it is such a radical move. I don't think there's any afterlife. I don't believe in magic. Our consciousness is embedded in the material substratum of our brains. When those neurons stop firing, there's not going to be any more Glenn Loury, just like there isn't any longer a Linda Datcher Loury. This was, actually a critical thing for me, because the difference between thinking that this spirit that is within each of us lives on after our bodies decay and not thinking so it's profound, it's fundamental, it's radical. There is no solace. Death is the end. You perhaps can think about the larger, point of view about life, which is it's not about me, it's about life. And life goes on, but I don't go on. This is my view, and I'm not looking for consolation. I'm looking for the courage to face up to the reality of my own finitude.
Are there ways to lead a life that you think prepare one to confront death with more equanimity than others? I mean, let's do the thought experiment with your cocaine period, and let's imagine that wasn't a self-defeating lifestyle, which it kind of is, because the more you do, the more you need, and pretty soon you don't have a job and you're suffering. So it just doesn't work. But suppose hedonism worked. Suppose you could just take these drugs and they made you feel better, and it was pretty enduring, and you had sex with a series of strangers, and that felt good, and that was your whole life. And then imagine, in contrast, the life you've actually lived since that period, when you did the things you've talked about, helping students along the path toward a productive life, loving your children, and so on. I mean, do you think the prospect of death would be equally bleak regardless, or that you have a right to confront, in some sense you have a right to confront death with more equanimity in one case than the other, or what? Now I'm babbling, so step in and say something.
Well, what I think, I mean, I'm contrasting this hedonistic thing with its opposite, and you're asking me whether or not the way one faces death should depend in some way on how it is that one has lived one's life, or do I think so? And I do think so. And this is not going to be a philosophically profound observation, but I mean, if we are finite, it doesn't mean that the effect of us having lived is finite. It can echo on, and it can echo on through other people and through what it is that we do with the brief time that we have here. So that if I spent my time in a cubicle experiencing sensations that titillated various areas of my brain and caused me to be, quote, happy, close quote, and then expired, I would have wasted my life. My life would have been no more than the subjective experience of this particular individual for this very brief period of time. Whereas if I had expended my time in an effort to develop my own gifts to their maximal extent, and then to try to share the benefits of those gifts with the world through various institutions and practices, such as the university and being a teacher, being a philanthropist, creating things that didn't exist before as a scientist or whatever, I would feel that this life, which is finite, and the day will come when I have to recognize that it's my last day, should I be lucky enough to be conscious of my own death approaching, I could view that with a little bit, I'm not going to say equanimity. I mean, I don't want to die. Nobody wants to die. That's terrible. That's a catastrophe. It's the end of me. But at least I could look at it as saying this brief period was worth more than simply titillating myself. I mean, I can't see it. I'm just speaking personally. Again, I'm not saying this is a profound philosophical observation, but I'd be terrified at the prospect of having to regret on my deathbed having wasted 70 or 80 years doing nothing but having a good time, when God imbued me with, I still use that language sometimes, even if I'm not believing in the literal theological claims, I find the language comforting in a way. I'm not responsible for the gifts of intellect and articulateness and whatever insight I might have as a scholar and as a writer and a person. I'm not personally responsible for that, so I want to give, as it were, credit where credit is due. So, okay, you can see I'm confused, Bob.
Yeah, you want to give credit to whom it may concern, is the old joke about who Unitarians pray to. Well, thank you so much for being so candid. I think people who watch or listen to your show, the Glenn Show on Blogging Heads regularly, won't be surprised by your candor, because you confront just sheerly intellectual questions with the same kind of I think honesty and self-disclosure that you've shown here. But it's especially it takes a particular kind of courage, I think, once you move to this personal realm to do that. So thank you, thanks so much, Glenn.
Well, thank you for that comment, Bob, and it's my pleasure. I'm glad to contribute something here.
Okay, well, you certainly have in a lot of domains, including this one. Thanks a lot.